He was 11 years old the day his father died, a boy in a borrowed coat, standing in the Kansas wind at a graveside, knowing without anyone having to tell him that the money was gone, the protection was gone, and the job of keeping his mother and his sisters alive had just fallen on him. What does a boy do when the roof comes off his world at 11? What does a man become when he learns, somewhere along the way, that his own life can be sold to a paying crowd? This is the story of Buffalo Bill. Welcome back to Western Pioneer Archives. Before we begin, if you believe the true frontier deserves to be remembered honestly, take a moment to subscribe so these stories keep finding you. And as you listen today, ask yourself one question. Where does a real man end and a legend begin? Leave your answer in the comments. The frontier that made William F. Cody did not survive him. That is the first thing to understand. He was born in the same decade as the last great bison herds, and he died the year America entered the First World War. In the 70 years between those two dates, a continent changed in ways that no generation had ever witnessed before, and very few have witnessed since. Railroads crossed the plains. Barbed wire divided the open range. The indigenous nations that had lived on the grasslands for centuries were confined to reservations. The bison herds that had numbered in the tens of millions were shot almost to extinction. Towns sprang up out of nothing along the rail lines and then fell silent when the trains stopped coming. Gold camps turned into ghost camps. Oil was found in Wyoming. Coal was found in Montana. And across all of it, from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast, the American public was told a story about what had happened. A story about brave scouts and cavalry charges. A story about cowboys and stagecoaches. A story about the taming of something wild. The man who told that story more loudly, more profitably, and to more people than anyone else alive was William F. Cody. And the trouble with Cody is that the story he told was not a lie. It was also not the truth. It was something else, something between the two, something that the American mind had never quite had to deal with before and has been struggling with ever since. To understand him, you have to start with the world he was born into. In February of 1846, when Cody came into the world on a farm just outside LeClaire, Iowa territory, the United States had not yet fought the war with Mexico. California and the entire Southwest were still Mexican soil. The Oregon Trail was 4 years old. The Mormons had not yet reached the Great Salt Lake. The Donner Party had not yet set out. Texas had only been a state for 2 months. And beyond the Missouri River, the map of the American West was a blank space crossed by a few dotted lines, marked mostly by the names of rivers and by the names of the indigenous nations who controlled the country between them. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Pawnee, the Shoshone. Nations with standing armies, organized governments, and territorial claims that had existed for generations. Nations that were about to be torn apart by what was coming. What was coming was the greatest migration the continent had ever seen. Between 1840 and 1860, roughly 300,000 white American settlers would cross the plains to Oregon, California, and Utah. By 1870, the Transcontinental Railroad would have connected the two oceans. By 1890, the United States Census Bureau would formally declare that the American frontier was closed. In less than 50 years, the land that Cody's parents had set out to see would be filled with towns, plowed into farms, fenced into ranches, and laced with telegraph wire. The pace of it was almost impossible to absorb. A child born on one side of that transformation could not have imagined the world on the other side, and Cody was exactly such a child. His father, Isaac Cody, came from a family with roots in what is now Mississauga, Ontario, just west of Toronto. Isaac had been born there in 1811, and the Cody name was old enough in that part of Upper Canada that the family had donated the land for the Dixie Union Chapel, where the infant William was baptized in 1847. His mother, Mary Ann Bonsell Laycock, came from Trenton, New Jersey, by way of Cincinnati, where she had gone to teach school. She was a descendant of a Pennsylvania Quaker named Josiah Bunting. The family lived briefly in Ontario after the child's birth, then moved back across the border to Iowa, and then, in 1853, Isaac Cody sold his land in Scott County, Iowa, for $2,000 and moved the whole family west to Fort Leavenworth, in what was about to become one of the most violent places in America. Kansas Territory in the mid-1850s was a war zone. The question of whether Kansas would enter the Union as a slave state or a free state was being decided not by legislators, but by armed men with knives and rifles, and the Cody family had walked straight into the middle of it. Isaac Cody was against slavery, and he was not shy about saying so. In the fall of 1854, he was invited to speak at a trading post called Rivley's Store, where pro-slavery men often gathered. His anti-slavery speech so enraged the crowd that a man jumped up and stabbed him twice with a Bowie knife. Isaac never fully recovered from the wounds. For the next 2.5 years, he moved between safe houses, spent weeks away from home trying to stay alive, and in April of 1857, he came home sick from a trip to Ohio and died. He was 46. His son William, who would one day be known to the world as Buffalo Bill, was 11 years old, and from that moment on, the family had no income, no protector, and no margin for error. So the boy went to work. At 11 years old, William F. Cody was hired by the freight firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell as what the company called a boy extra. His job, as he remembered it later, was to ride up and down the length of the wagon trains carrying messages between the teamsters and the foreman. What his job actually was, according to historians who have gone through the firm's surviving records, was probably something even more mundane. He likely rode 3 miles back and forth between the company's office in Leavenworth and the nearest telegraph station. Either way, he was a boy on a horse, working for pay, keeping his mother and his sisters fed, and learning the country that would eventually make him famous. By the time he was 12, he was riding with freight caravans across the plains. By 14, he had been attached, as an unofficial member, to what his later autobiographies called Johnston's Army, on its way to put down the rumored Mormon uprising in Utah. By 15, depending on whose account you believe, he was either riding for the Pony Express or he was not. That question, and what it tells us about the rest of his life, will need a chapter of its own. The one thing that every account agrees on is that by the time he was 20 years old, William F. Cody had ridden, camped, fought, hunted, and worked across more of the North American continent than almost any American alive. He had seen Kansas burn. He had crossed the Rocky Mountains. He had buried people he loved. He had been shot at. He had killed men, or at least claimed to have, and the claim was plausible enough that the officers who later hired him as a scout took him at his word. He was, in other words, the kind of young man the Army needed, and the kind of young man the American public was just beginning to realize existed. The dime novel industry in New York had started producing cheap paperback adventure stories by the thousands, and the appetite for frontier heroes was growing faster than the real frontier could supply them. The market was hungry. The moment was ripe. And somewhere between the Loop Fork of the Platte River and the stages of Chicago, William F. Cody was about to walk into it. But the story of how he got there is not the story of a man stumbling into fame. It is the story of a man who learned, through years of real hardship and real danger, that the things he had actually done could be sold. And then it is the story of the consequences, because when you sell your own life as entertainment, you change what your life was. You change how the people around you are remembered. You change what the audience believes happened. And sometimes, when the audience is large enough, you change history itself. That is what Cody did. He took the real frontier, the one with bison and soldiers and Lakota warriors and starving settlers and broken treaties and army scouts riding through country where a wrong turn could get you killed, and he put it in an arena. He made the audience sit down. He made them pay for a ticket. He made them believe that what they were seeing in the arena was what had actually happened out there on the plains. And then, while they were believing it, the real frontier finished dying behind his back. This is the story of a man who rode for the army, killed for the army, earned the Medal of Honor from the army, and then went on stage and turned his own life into a nightly show. This is the story of a man who killed a Cheyenne warrior on July 17, 1876, and was performing the killing on a Rochester stage by October. This is the story of a man who hired Sitting Bull and made him a friend. This is the story of a man who loved his wife badly and died broke after having made several fortunes. This is the story of the Pony Express and the Kansas Pacific Railroad and the Battle of Warbonnet Creek and the American Exhibition of 1887 and the private audience with Queen Victoria and the meeting with Pope Leo XIII. This is the story of a man who became, for a moment at the turn of the 20th century, the most famous American alive. But more than all of that, it is the story of the last great American showman of the real frontier. Because everything that came after, every Western film, every rodeo, every cowboy song, every myth the country tells itself about the men who rode west, runs through the arena that Cody built in North Platte, Nebraska, in the summer of 1883. He did not invent the frontier. He invented its memory. To understand what William F. Cody became, you have to stop at the age of 11 and watch him bury his father. It is the defining fact of his life. Isaac Cody had gone to Ohio that spring of 1857 to recruit anti-slavery settlers to bring back to Kansas because the pro-slavery faction was winning the on-the-ground fight for the territory, and Isaac believed the only way to win was to import more free soil families. He got sick on the return trip. The respiratory infection he picked up combined with the old stab wounds from the Rivley's store attack and a kidney condition that had been eating at him for years. He made it home. He died there. And the oldest surviving Cody son, 11 years old, inherited the responsibility for his mother and his sisters. There was no money. The family had spent what it had on the move from Iowa and on the fight to keep Isaac alive. What they had was a house, a piece of land, and a boy who could ride. So the boy rode. He rode for Russell, Majors, and Waddell, the biggest freighting outfit on the plains. Alexander Majors, one of the three partners, required every employee to sign a pledge promising not to use profane language, not to drink intoxicating liquor, not to gamble, not to treat animals cruelly, and to conduct himself honestly. Majors was a devout Baptist who believed that good men made good freight companies. The boy, Cody, signed the pledge, took his oath, and began his working life. Whether the company actually sent him on the cross-country rides he later described, or whether he spent most of his first year carrying messages the 3 miles from Leavenworth to the telegraph station, is a question historians have argued over for a century. The answer is probably both. He did some of each. The grand rides came later. The telegraph errands came first. What matters is that by the age of 12, he was a professional. He was earning wages, he was feeding his family, and he was learning, day after day, the country between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains. When he was 14, in 1860, Cody caught what he later called the gold fever. News had come east about strikes at Fort Colville in what is now Washington State, and at the Holcomb Valley diggings in the mountains above San Bernardino, California. Every teenage boy in Kansas Territory who had a horse and a few dollars was imagining himself rich. Cody set out. He did not get far. According to his own account, he met an agent for the Pony Express somewhere along the way, and he signed on. The Pony Express, at that point, was brand new. The idea of relay riders carrying the mail from Missouri to California across 1,900 miles of open country had only been launched in the spring of 1860 by the same company Cody already worked for, Russell, Majors, and Waddell. It was a gamble. The company was betting that a fast mail service could win a federal contract that would offset the enormous cost of running it. The riders were young, light, and usually desperate. The job was to cover a stretch of 75 or 100 miles, change horses every 10 or 15 miles at a relay station, hand the mail pouch off to the next rider, and then sleep until it was time to ride the other direction. Cody said he did that job. He said he rode for the Pony Express at the age of 14. He said in later years that he had once made a famous round trip of 322 miles in a single run because the rider who was supposed to take the mail from him at a relay station called Three Crossings had been killed, and there was no replacement. He said he kept riding. He said he made the longest ride in the history of the Pony Express. The trouble is that his name does not appear in the surviving Pony Express records, and there are no surviving Pony Express records that list every rider, so that by itself does not settle the matter. Alexander Majors, the old Baptist partner in Russell, Majors, and Waddell, wrote in his 1893 memoir that William F. Cody was among the most daring riders of the Pony Express. But Cody helped finance the publication of Majors's book. He wrote the foreword. He had a direct, personal, financial interest in what was said inside its pages. One of the most careful modern historians of Cody's life, Lewis S. Warren of the University of California at Davis, has argued that Cody almost certainly never rode for the Pony Express at all. He may have worked on building the stations, he may have ferried messages for the parent freight company. But the long rides he described, Warren has argued, belonged to the realm of story rather than the realm of fact. The Britannica entry on Cody takes a middle position. It notes that Cody's name does not appear in the official Pony Express records, but also that there is significant evidence he served 2 tours of duty as a rider, including his own account and Majors's published testimony. The Pony Express National Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri, which has studied the question as carefully as anyone, takes the position that Cody probably rode, but probably embellished considerably what the riding looked like. So where does that leave the truth? The honest answer is that it leaves the truth in exactly the place where Cody's whole life sat. Somewhere between the real country and the story of the real country. He may have ridden. He may not have. He almost certainly did not ride 322 miles in a single stretch at the age of 14, but he was, beyond any dispute, a working boy on the plains in 1860, employed by the same company that ran the Pony Express, riding horses for pay across country that most Americans had never seen. What he made of that, and how he told it afterwards, is the first example of a habit that would define his adult life. He did not make up the frontier. He performed it. However much or little he rode for the Pony Express, the ride came to an end when his mother got sick. He came home to Leavenworth to take care of her, and when she recovered, the Civil War had come. Cody tried to enlist in the Union Army. He was 15, tall for his age, and he wanted to fight. The Army refused him. He was too young, so he went back to what he knew. He signed on with a freight caravan that delivered supplies to Fort Laramie in what was then Dakota Territory and what is now southeastern Wyoming. He spent the first 2.5 years of the Civil War hauling Army provisions across the country that would later make his name. He carried flour and pork and coffee and powder and shot. He slept on the ground. He traveled with men who would fight in skirmishes along the way. He watched a Union teamster trade shots with Confederate sympathizers in Missouri and Kansas. The war reached him even when he was not in uniform. In February of 1864, at the age of 17, he was finally old enough to enlist. He joined Company H of the 7th Kansas Cavalry, a regiment known as the Jayhawkers for its reputation as a hard-hitting, sometimes brutal, anti-slavery unit. The 7th Kansas had already made itself infamous in Missouri for what some historians have called a campaign of looting and burning against Confederate sympathizers. Whether Cody participated in any of that or joined the regiment late enough to miss the worst of it is unclear. What is clear from the records is that he served as a private, attached as a teamster, meaning he was responsible for handling horses and wagons rather than fighting in the line. He saw action in Tennessee and Missouri. He finished the war in 1865. He was discharged alive, which was more than 1 million other young American men could say. And in the spring of 1866, in a hotel in St. Louis, where his regiment had briefly been stationed at the end of the war, William F. Cody, 20 years old, met a young woman named Louisa Frederici. They were married on March 6, 1866. The courtship was short. The marriage would be long. It would outlast everything he did afterward. It would contain 4 children, the deaths of 3 of them, public accusations of infidelity, a divorce trial in 1905 that he would lose, and a final reconciliation in 1910 that held until he died in 1917. It was, by every surviving account, a hard marriage, but it was also the one human relationship of his adult life that lasted from the beginning to the end. Louisa was there when he was a broke Civil War veteran looking for work. She was there when he was the most famous man in America. And she was there when he died in Denver, baptized into the Catholic Church the day before, in a rented room in his sister's house, with almost none of his fortune left. But that was all 50 years away. In 1866, he had a new wife, no steady job, and the whole country west of the Missouri opening up to anyone with the nerve to work it. He needed a living. He took the only kind of living he knew how to make. He went back to the plains. The plains Cody returned to in 1866 were not the plains he had left. The war had ended, but a new war was just beginning. The end of the Civil War freed hundreds of thousands of federal troops who had been fighting in the East, and many of them, along with a new generation of officers looking for reputations, were now being sent west to put down indigenous resistance to continued settlement. The Southern Plains, the Central Plains, the Northern Plains. Every one of them was now contested. The Lakota and Cheyenne had been watching white encroachment for a generation. They had signed treaties. They had seen the treaties broken. They were now beginning the sustained military resistance that would run for the next 25 years and that the United States government would eventually call the Indian Wars. It was into this expanding conflict and into the federal money that was suddenly pouring into the western forts that William F. Cody walked looking for work. In Junction City, Kansas, in 1866, he ran into an old friend, James Butler Hickok, Wild Bill. The two had known each other from earlier freighting days. Hickok was now working as a civilian scout for the Army, and he was making good money at it. He suggested Cody try the same thing. Cody took the suggestion. He enlisted at Fort Ellsworth in central Kansas and began scouting between that post and the new Fort Fletcher to the west, which would soon be relocated and renamed Fort Hays. The job of an Army scout was to ride ahead of a column of cavalry, to find water and forage, to read the country for signs of trouble, and to make contact, when it was safe to, with the indigenous bands moving through the area. It was dangerous work. Scouts rode alone or in small groups. They were often the first to make contact with a hostile party. They were paid well because the job tended to kill people. Cody was good at it. The officers who hired him kept rehiring him. He scouted for Captain George Augustus Arms at the Battle of the Saline River in the summer of 1867. He scouted briefly for Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, guiding Custer to Fort Larned and racing him in an impromptu horse race along the way, which Custer won. He worked through that summer and into the fall, and in late 1867, because the Kansas Pacific Railway was being built west through Hays City and the work crews needed meat, he was granted a leave of absence from his scouting duties to do what turned out to be the work that gave him his name. The contract to supply buffalo meat to the railroad was held by a company called Goddard Brothers, who needed a hunter who could keep up with the pace of construction. The crews were laying track. The track needed workers. The workers needed to eat. And so Cody, who was a superb horseman and an excellent shot, took the contract. According to his own later accounting, he killed 4,282 buffalo in the 17 or 18 months he held the job between 1867 and 1868. The number may be high, it may be low, but the scale is about right. He was, by any measure, one of the most prolific professional meat hunters in the history of the Kansas Pacific. The competing hunter, who also claimed rights to the title Buffalo Bill, was a man named William Comstock. Comstock was part Cheyenne. He was a noted scout, interpreter, and hunter. He and Cody agreed to settle the name by holding a contest. They met near Sheridan, Kansas, in the fall of 1868. They shot for 8 hours. Comstock used a fast-firing Henry repeating rifle. Cody used a larger caliber Springfield Model 1866, a single-shot rifle he had named Lucretia Borgia, after the character in the Donizetti opera, then popular on American stages. Cody won the contest 68 buffalo to 48. From that day forward, the name Buffalo Bill belonged to William F. Cody. The hunting was brutal work. Cody would leave camp before dawn, ride out to the moving edge of a herd, pick his angle, and work fast. His technique, which he described later and which other professional hunters confirmed, was to ride to the front of a running herd rather than chasing from the rear, targeting the leaders and forcing the animals behind them to circle. A good hunter could drop a dozen animals in the space of a few acres rather than leaving a trail of carcasses scattered across 3 miles of prairie. Cody was one of the best who ever did it. The meat wagons followed. The railroad crews ate. The track kept moving west. By the time the contract ended, Cody had made himself the most famous buffalo hunter in the country. The killing would cost him later. In the decade after Cody's contract, professional hide hunters would drive the great herds nearly to extinction. By the early 1880s, the animals that had once taken a day to ride through would be gone from most of the plains, and Cody, in his 50s, would become one of the early public voices calling for what was left of them to be protected. But that was all still to come. In 1868, he was 22 years old, he had a wife and a daughter in Leavenworth, and the name he had won from William Comstock had just become the most bankable asset he owned. He returned to Army service in 1868, and here is where the documentary record gives us one of the most remarkable single rides in the history of the American frontier. In the late summer of that year, Cody was stationed at Fort Larned in central Kansas, when the commanding officer needed to communicate urgently with several other posts. The man chosen to carry the dispatches was Cody. He left Fort Larned and rode to Fort Zara. He was briefly captured along the way and escaped. He rode from Fort Zara to Fort Hays, from Fort Hays to Fort Dodge, from Fort Dodge back to Fort Larned, from Fort Larned back to Fort Hays. 350 miles, 58 hours, through country where every mile held the possibility of an ambush. He covered the last 35 miles on foot because his last horse was spent. When he came into Fort Hays and handed over the final dispatch, General Philip Sheridan, who happened to be at the post, read the account of what Cody had done and assigned him Chief of Scouts for the 5th Cavalry Regiment. This is documented. This is not a story Cody told about himself and that nobody else witnessed. This is in the regimental records. This is in the memoirs of officers who served with him. This is, in many ways, the ride that earned him the reputation that every subsequent embellishment would rest on top of. Whatever he may or may not have done for the Pony Express at 14, at 22, he rode 350 miles in 58 hours as a lone Federal dispatch courier, and he rode it through country where Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were actively targeting white riders, and he survived, and he delivered the mail. That is the kind of thing a man can build a life on. Over the next several years, from 1868 through 1872, Cody served as Chief of Scouts for the 5th Cavalry and, later, for the 3rd Cavalry in the ongoing campaigns against Plains nations. He fought in 16 engagements, according to his surviving Army records. He became well known among the officer corps. In January of 1872, when the Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich of Russia came to the United States on a state visit and expressed interest in a buffalo hunt, it was Cody who was assigned to be his guide. He took the Grand Duke out into the Nebraska plains along with General Sheridan and General Custer and arranged a successful hunt. The trip was covered by every major American newspaper. The images of Cody, long-haired and buck-skinned, riding alongside European royalty, were reprinted across the country. He was already becoming, to the American public, a figure. Not yet a star, but a figure. And then, in the spring of 1869, a man named Ned Buntline came west. Buntline was a New York dime novelist whose real name was Edward Zane Carroll Judson. He wrote fast, drank heavily, and had a nose for commercial literature that was almost supernatural. He had come west looking for a character. He was introduced to Cody, rode with him for a while, and went back to New York with his notebook full. That December, a serial novel called Buffalo Bill, King of the Bordermen, began running on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The plot was almost entirely invented. The character was based loosely on the real man Buntline had met in Nebraska. But the readership of the Chicago Tribune and of the dozens of other papers that would run the novel and its many sequels had no way of knowing what was real and what was not. As far as they were concerned, Buffalo Bill was a frontier hero. The more they read, the more famous he became. And the more famous he became, the more Buntline and his imitators wrote. By 1872, the novels had spawned a play. The play, called Buffalo Bill, opened at Niblo's Garden in New York. An actor named J.B. Studley played the title role. Cody, still serving as Chief of Scouts for the Army in the West, came east to see the play. He sat in the audience and watched another man pretend to be him. He watched the crowd go wild for it. He walked out of the theater that night changed. He had seen what his life was worth on a stage. He had seen what an audience in New York would pay for the chance to believe in the frontier. And he began, even then, to calculate. He did not yet know what he would build, but he had seen the shape of the future, and the shape was an arena with an audience in it, and the man in the arena was going to be him. The documentary record at this point in Cody's life is rich enough that we can be confident about one thing. He did not become famous by accident. He became famous because he decided to. The Medal of Honor came in the spring of 1872. The action that earned it had taken place on April 26th of that year, along the South Fork of the Loup River in Nebraska. Cody was guiding a small detachment of the 3rd Cavalry under Captain Charles Meinhold that was pursuing a band of raiders. The exact sequence of events has been preserved in the regimental records and in the citation that was eventually issued. Cody located the raiders' camp, guided the troopers into position, and when the engagement began, he charged forward under fire and, according to the contemporary Army report, distinguished himself by gallantry in action. At least one warrior was killed in the exchange. Soldiers whose lives had been at risk were brought out safely. Cody had done what a scout was hired to do, and he had done it in a way that the officers above him thought rose well beyond the level that duty required. On May 22, 1872, less than a month after the action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. It is worth stopping here and understanding what that medal meant in 1872 and what happened to it afterwards. The Medal of Honor in the early 1870s was not yet the solitary peak of American military decoration that it has since become. There were other medals and ribbons in circulation. The criteria for the award were looser. Civilians attached to Army units, if they performed conspicuous acts of valor, were eligible to receive it. Several dozen civilian scouts during the Indian Wars received the medal under those criteria. Cody was one of them. But in 1917, the year Cody died, Congress passed a law restructuring American military decorations into a formal hierarchy, with the Medal of Honor placed at the top as the highest honor the nation could bestow. The new law was accompanied by new criteria. Under those new criteria, the medal could be awarded only to commissioned officers or enlisted soldiers, and only for acts of gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. The War Department was then directed to review the entire list of prior Medal of Honor recipients and to strike from the rolls anyone who did not meet the new standards. 911 medals were rescinded. 5 of those belonged to civilian Army scouts who had served in the Indian Wars. One of those was William F. Cody. The law was enacted just days before Cody's death. He never knew. His medal was revoked a month after he was buried. His family knew. His grandson, William G. Cody, wrote letters to Congress for decades asking that the medal be restored. The letters accumulated. No one in Washington did anything with them. Finally, in 1988, one of those letters reached the office of Senator Allen K. Simpson of Wyoming. A legislative assistant in Simpson's office took up the case. He drafted a legal brief arguing that civilian scouts during the Indian Wars had, in practical terms, been treated as officers by the Army and that they should be considered such for the purposes of the Medal of Honor. The brief went to the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense referred it to the Army Board for correction of military records. The board deliberated for months. In June of 1989, the board agreed. It formally amended Cody's service record to classify him as an enlisted soldier, and it restored the Medal of Honor to him, along with 4 other civilian scouts whose medals had been rescinded under the 1917 review. William G. Cody received the restored medal on behalf of his grandfather 72 years after the original award had been taken back. That is the formal history of Cody's Medal of Honor. But the question of what he actually did to earn it, and how much of what he did was the kind of conspicuous gallantry that the old criterion required, is worth sitting with. He was 26 years old. He was a civilian employed by the Army at a scout's wage. He rode in the direction of gunfire when he did not have to. He drew enemy fire away from troopers who would otherwise have been hit. He located hostile positions under conditions where being located himself would have ended the engagement with his own death. He did, in short, the kind of work that the Medal of Honor was created to recognize. The technicality that stripped the medal in 1917 was a bureaucratic one. The restoration in 1989 was, by the terms of the original action, the correct outcome. Cody earned the medal. He kept it by what he did. He lost it by what Congress did, and his family got it back. But the Medal of Honor was not what made him famous. What made him famous was what he did next. In December of 1872, Cody traveled to Chicago to make his stage debut. Ned Buntline had written a new play called The Scouts of the Prairie, and he had convinced Cody, along with another frontiersman named Texas Jack Omohundro, to appear in it. The play was bad. The dialogue was impossible. The reviews were savage. One Chicago critic wrote that Cody's performance was like watching a diffident schoolboy recite his catechism. But the audience did not care about the reviews. The audience was paying to see Buffalo Bill in person. The theater sold out every night. The production moved on to other cities. Other frontiersmen were added. The script was rewritten. The whole thing was rough, chaotic, financially precarious, and enormously successful. In 1873, Cody wrote to Wild Bill Hickok in Kansas and invited him to join the show. Hickok came. Hickok hated it. He hid behind the scenery when he was supposed to be on stage. He drank. At one performance, when the stage lights turned on him and he found himself blinded in the spotlight, he drew a revolver and shot it out. The audience howled. Cody paid for the lamp. Within a few months, Hickok was released from the company. He went back to the West. 3 years later, in 1876, he would be murdered in Deadwood, South Dakota, shot in the back of the head while holding a hand of aces and eights that would forever afterward be called the dead man's hand. Cody kept performing. He founded his own troupe in 1874 called the Buffalo Bill Combination. He split his time. Part of the year he was on stage in the East, performing melodramatic versions of frontier events. Part of the year he was back on the plains, scouting for the Army, fighting in campaigns, keeping the buckskin reality that he was selling alive by actually living it. Almost nobody else in American public life was doing this. Almost nobody else was straddling the line between the real frontier and the stage depiction of it. It was, in every sense, a unique career. And here is the thing that has been missed by many of his critics, then and now. The reason the audiences came was not that Cody was lying to them. The reason they came was that Cody, unlike every other frontiersman who had ever tried to cash in on his reputation, actually kept going back out. He was not a retired scout telling stories. He was an active scout who performed in the winter and fought in the summer. The buckskin on his costume was worn from real use. The knife on his belt had real cuts. The horse he rode on stage was the same horse, or nearly, that he rode on campaign. The audience was watching a man who had not yet stopped being the man he was pretending to be. For the next 4 years, he toured. The plays got better. The staging got more elaborate. He began to hire a company of actors to support him. The money began to flow in. He bought property in North Platte, Nebraska, where his wife Louisa and their children, Arta and Kit and Aura and Irma, were now living. He began to imagine, for the first time, what it might look like to make his entire living this way, to be a performer full-time. Then, on June 25th, 1876, on a ridge above the Little Bighorn River in eastern Montana Territory, George Armstrong Custer and 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry were annihilated by a combined Lakota and Northern Cheyenne force. 268 American soldiers died. The news took almost 2 weeks to reach the East Coast. When it arrived, it was the biggest shock the American public had received since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. A United States Army regiment had been wiped out. The country that had just finished celebrating its centennial with a great exposition in Philadelphia was now reading that its famous Indian fighting general, the hero of the Civil War, the golden-haired cavalryman of every Eastern newspaper, was dead on a Montana hillside along with every man under his command. And William F. Cody, 30 years old, was on a stage in Wilmington, Delaware, performing a play about the West. He did what he always did. He read the papers. He understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. Custer had been his friend, or at least his former commander. The Army was going to need scouts again, and it was going to need them quickly. The American public was going to want revenge, and the man who took it was going to matter. Cody did not finish the theatrical season. He did not wait. He sent a telegram east to the commanding officer of the 5th Cavalry, Colonel Wesley Merritt, offering his services as Chief of Scouts. Merritt accepted. Cody packed his costume trunks, kissed Louisa goodbye, and headed west on the train. He rejoined the 5th Cavalry in Nebraska in early July of 1876. He was wearing a theatrical stage costume when he arrived. He was still wearing it 3 weeks later, on July 17th, at a remote creek bed in the Nebraska Sandhills, when he shot a young Cheyenne warrior named Yellow Hair, and the first scene of the most important story in the rest of his life began to unfold. The 5th Cavalry had been ordered to block the supply trail between the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail Indian agencies in northwestern Nebraska and the Powder River country of northeastern Wyoming and southeastern Montana. After the victory at the Little Bighorn, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors and their families had been leaving the agencies in growing numbers to join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in the north. The Army wanted that flow cut. If the northern camps could be kept small, the Army reasoned, they could be found and beaten. If the northern camps swelled with refugees, they would be impossible to defeat in open country. Merritt's 5th Cavalry, with Cody as its Chief of Scouts, rode north through the Black Hills of northwestern Nebraska in the first weeks of July 1876. The soldiers were cursing the heat, the dust, the short rations, and their own bad luck. For a full month they had chased rumors. They had skirmished with small bands, but had not yet engaged in anything like a proper fight. They were tired, and they were angry, and they wanted the kind of engagement that would let them say they had avenged Custer. On the evening of July 16, 1876, Merritt's scouts brought in word that a band of about 30 Cheyenne from Morning Star's village, which had been encamped on the Red Cloud Reservation, had left the agency and was moving north. They would be crossing a small stream called Warbonnet Creek sometime the next morning, on a supply trail that led up toward the Powder River country. Merritt made his plan. He would hide his companies in the low hills above the crossing. When the Cheyenne came down to water their horses, the troopers would come out from behind the ridge and trap them in the creek bed. It was a classic ambush, and it required, above all else, that nobody on the American side be seen until the trap was sprung. At dawn on July 17th, Cody rode out alone to the crossing to reconnoiter the ground. When he came back to the hidden cavalry, he was dressed in a stage costume that he had brought with him from the east. A Captain Charles King, who was watching from a nearby ridge, later wrote about the outfit. Cody was wearing a red silk shirt with puffy sleeves, decorated with silver buttons. His trousers were black velvet, with silver braid running down the sides. He wore an oversized beaver felt hat with a drooping brim and a broad leather belt with a large silver buckle. One of the troopers who saw him said later that he looked more like a fiesta-bound Mexican vaquero than a United States Army scout going into a fight. The choice of outfit was not an accident. Cody had been performing the character of Buffalo Bill for 4 years on stages in New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. He knew that he was going to be seen. He knew that whatever happened that morning was going to be in the newspapers by the end of the week. And he knew that what he wore to the engagement would shape how the engagement was remembered. This is the part of the story where it is important to be careful. What happened at Warbonnet Creek on the morning of July 17, 1876, has been written about in almost every way a skirmish can be written about. The historian Paul L. Hedren, in his 1980 book First Scalp for Custer, collected and compared every surviving account. What follows is, as close as the documentary record will permit, what actually happened. The Cheyenne column came down the trail toward the creek around 9 in the morning. They were moving at an easy pace. They did not know the cavalry was hidden on the ridges above, but a small group of Cheyenne scouts, maybe 7 or 8 young warriors, including Yellow Hair, rode ahead of the main group. They were the advance party. They were the ones who would reach the creek first. Either by accident or by observation, they spotted 2 soldiers, couriers from another command, riding along a distant ridge carrying messages. The Cheyenne scouts began to angle toward the couriers. If they reached them, they would kill them. If the soldiers had time to call out, the entire ambush would be blown. Cody saw the problem and proposed the solution. He and a small group of other scouts would ride out from cover and cut off the young Cheyenne scouts before they could reach the couriers. Merritt approved. Cody rode out. What followed lasted at most a few minutes. Cody and Yellow Hair saw each other at close range. Both raised their rifles. Both fired. One or both of them had his horse shot out from under him in the exchange. Yellow Hair went down. Cody ran forward with a bowie knife. He scalped Yellow Hair. He took the war bonnet. He took the shield. He took the pony's bridle. He took the gun. He gathered the whole set of items into his arms and held them up for the troopers who were now surging forward over the ridge behind him. The remaining Cheyenne scouts scattered. The main column, seeing what had happened, turned around and began to race back toward the Red Cloud Agency. The cavalry pursued them. The running skirmish continued for 34 miles. Not one American soldier was killed. A few Cheyenne were wounded. Yellow Hair was the only warrior who died. By Cody's later telling, as he stood over Yellow Hair's body with the scalp in his upraised hand, he shouted to the troopers watching him, "The first scalp for Custer." It has become the most famous single line in the history of the American Indian Wars. It has been printed in thousands of books. It has been repeated in every film ever made about Buffalo Bill. It has been etched onto monuments. But no one else on the field that day ever remembered hearing Cody say it. Cody himself wrote to his wife Louisa the very next day on July 18th. The letter survives. It is held in the archives of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. The letter is plain, almost brusque. He wrote that there had been a fight. He wrote that he had killed a Cheyenne chief he called Yellow Hand in a single-handed fight. He asked her, when he reached Fort Laramie, to arrange for the war bonnet, the shield, the bridle, the whip, the arms, and the scalp to be shipped back east to a clothing merchant named Kerngood in Rochester, New York, to be put on display in his shop window. That was the letter. Read that again. A clothing merchant in Rochester, a shop window, on display. Less than 24 hours after the killing, while the man who had been killed was not yet cold, Cody was already arranging for the artifacts of the killing to be sent east to be seen by the paying public. This is the moment. This is when the man who would become the most famous American in the world began to understand with perfect clarity what his life was going to be. He was not going to be a scout. He was not going to be a soldier. He was going to be the person who performed these things on a stage, and he was going to use the real evidence of what he had done as stage properties in a nightly drama. By October of 1876, 3 months after the killing, Cody was back in the East. He had written a new play called The Red Right Hand, or Buffalo Bill's First Scalp for Custer. He was performing in it. The costume he wore on stage was the same stage costume he had worn to the fight. The scalp was in a display case near the stage, together with the war bonnet and the weapons. He killed Yellow Hair again, every night, 6 nights a week, in cities across the American Northeast. The audience could not get enough of it. The ticket prices rose, the touring schedule expanded, the money came in. The speed of the turnaround is what matters. 12 weeks from a Nebraska creek bed to a Rochester stage. Cody had taken an engagement that, by the standards of the Plains Wars, was a small skirmish, and he had turned it into the single most recognizable story of the entire Indian Wars era. He had not done it by accident. He had done it by understanding, faster than anyone else of his generation, that the American public wanted a Custer avenged and was prepared to pay for the avenging night after night. And about the central claim, the first scalp for Custer, the honest answer is that we do not know whether he said it on the field that day or whether he said it for the first time on a stage in Rochester in October. The troopers who were there that morning did not remember hearing it. Cody himself, in the letter to Louisa written the next day, did not mention saying it. The earliest appearance of the phrase in print comes from his own promotional material for the play that opened that fall. The most honest reading of the evidence is that the phrase was developed after the killing as a stage line and then retroactively moved back into the history of the killing itself. Like so much else in Cody's life, the phrase began as performance and ended as fact, or began as fact and ended as performance. The distinction no longer mattered by the time he was done with it. What mattered was the effect. The story of the killing, whatever had actually happened at the creek bed, was now the most bankable property in American popular entertainment. The scalp traveled with the show as a prop. The war bonnet traveled with it. The weapons traveled with it. Every theater manager from Boston to Chicago wanted Buffalo Bill on his stage. Every newspaper wanted a fresh interview. The dime novels, already running, accelerated. Ned Buntline's imitators were churning out Buffalo Bill adventures by the thousand. A young writer named Prentice Ingraham would eventually produce more than 200 separate Buffalo Bill novels under his own name alone. Between the novels and the stage plays and the newspaper coverage, Cody had become, by the beginning of 1877, the most commercially viable frontier figure in American history. He had turned a skirmish into a career. It was the line that built the Wild West. For 6 years after War Bonnet Creek, Cody kept up the split life. He performed on stage during the winter season with his Buffalo Bill combination. He went back to the plains in the summer and scouted or hunted or guided visiting dignitaries. He wrote his first autobiography, The Life and Adventures of Buffalo Bill, in 1879. He worked with ghostwriters and publicists who polished his public image. His children were growing up in North Platte. His marriage to Louisa was beginning to strain. He was making money, he was spending it, and he was still not quite famous the way he would eventually be famous. The stage plays were a curiosity. The dime novels were profitable but disreputable. The Medal of Honor had been awarded but barely mentioned in any theater program. He was a popular attraction. He was not yet an institution. The turn came on the 4th of July, 1882. The town of North Platte, Nebraska, needed a featured attraction for its Independence Day celebration. Cody was invited to organize it. He put together what he called the Old Glory Blowout. It included a bronco riding contest, a shooting exhibition, roping competitions, and a staged Pony Express relay. Something like 1,000 cowboys showed up to compete. Several thousand spectators came to watch. When it was over, Cody looked at what he had just put on, and he saw, for the first time, what the next phase of his career could be. In the spring of 1883, Cody partnered with a dentist and showman named Dr. William Frank Carver and organized a large-scale version of the North Platte event as a touring attraction. It opened in Omaha, Nebraska, in May of 1883 under the name Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Note the name. The word show was never part of the official title. Cody insisted on this in every press release and every poster for the rest of his life. It was not a show. It was a Wild West, a piece of country brought to a city for paying audiences. The distinction was important to him, and it was important because it signaled something he genuinely believed. He believed that what his performers did in the arena was not acting. It was the real West, displaced from its natural setting but otherwise authentic. Cowboys were real cowboys, The shooting was real shooting. The horses were real horses. And the indigenous people who rode in the show were real Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho. The Carver partnership did not last. Cody and Carver fought over money and direction, and by the end of the 1883 season, they had split. Cody found a new partner, a New York theatrical manager named Nate Salisbury, who was everything Carver was not. Salisbury was disciplined, financially careful, and a shrewd strategist about how the show should be positioned and staged. The Cody-Salisbury partnership would last for almost 20 years, until Salisbury's death in 1902, and it would be the engine that turned Buffalo Bill's Wild West from a touring novelty into a global phenomenon. The Wild West toured the United States through the mid-1880s, playing in major cities and county fairgrounds. The acts grew in number and complexity. The staged Pony Express relay became a signature. The bronco riding contest evolved into a full rodeo. Annie Oakley, a sharpshooter from Ohio who had defeated the famous marksman Frank Butler in a shooting match and then married him, joined the company and became its most popular attraction after Cody himself. A Lakota warrior named William Frederick Sweeney led a cowboy band that played music to accompany the acts. The climactic finale for many of the show's tours was a reenactment of an attack on a settler's cabin in which Cody would ride to the rescue at the head of a mounted cavalry charge. The audience, which included many people who had personally lived through the events being dramatized, would rise to its feet. Then, in the spring of 1885, Cody pulled off the single most famous booking in the history of American traveling entertainment. He signed Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader whose name had been attached, fairly or not, to the destruction of Custer at the Little Bighorn 9 years earlier, to a 4-month contract with the Wild West. The booking had been negotiated through the Standing Rock Indian Agency. Sitting Bull was paid $50 a week, plus a signing bonus, plus the right to sell his autograph at intermission and to keep the proceeds. He rode around the arena once at the beginning of each performance, seated on a horse, acknowledging the crowd. Every newspaper in every city the show visited covered the booking. Ticket sales surged. By the end of the 1885 season, Cody had proved something he had been working toward for a decade. He could book anyone. The Wild West was now the biggest stage in the United States. Sitting Bull and Cody had, by most surviving accounts, genuinely liked each other. They exchanged gifts at the end of the tour. Cody gave Sitting Bull a white horse that had been trained to perform tricks in the arena. Sitting Bull gave Cody a peace pipe and a pair of moccasins. There is a well-known photograph from that summer, taken in Montreal by the photographer William Notman, of the two men standing side by side. Cody kept a copy of the photograph on the wall of his study for the rest of his life. In 1887, the Wild West had traveled to England for the first time. It had been invited as part of the American exhibition, which coincided with the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. The Prince of Wales, who would later reign as King Edward VII, saw a preview performance and was impressed enough that he arranged a command performance for the Queen. Victoria attended. She enjoyed the show. On June 20th, 1887, she hosted a second command performance for her Jubilee guests, which included the future Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and the future King George V of Britain. Royalty from across Europe attended. The endorsement of the British Crown, at the summit of British imperial prestige, secured the Wild West's international reputation in a way that American audiences alone could never have done. By the time the first London run ended in October of 1887, more than 2.5 million tickets had been sold. The show would return to Europe 7 more times, 4 tours between 1887 and 1892, and 4 more between 1902 and 1906. It played London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, Paris, Barcelona, Rome, Naples, Verona, Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, Munich, Berlin. In 1890, the show performed in Rome, and a Wild West delegation was received at the Vatican by Pope Leo XIII. That same year, in a famous rope-throwing contest in the Prati di Castello neighborhood of Rome, Cody's American cowboys were defeated by a group of Italian butteri, traditional horsemen from the Roman Campagna, led by a man named Augusto Imperiale, who became a local hero and, later, the subject of comic strips and a monument in his hometown of Cisterna di Latina. In 1889, during the Paris Exposition that unveiled the Eiffel Tower, the French painter Rosa Bonheur, the most celebrated female painter in Europe, painted Cody's portrait. He sent a copy back to Louisa in North Platte. By the mid-1890s, William F. Cody was, by most serious measures, the most famous American alive. Larry McMurtry and other historians have argued the point. Mark Twain said, when Cody took the Wild West back to England for a second time, that if Americans wanted to send something across the ocean that was genuinely and distinctly American, the Wild West was it. Cody had been photographed by Gertrude Casebier. He had been painted by Bonheur. He had been received by Queen Victoria, Pope Leo, and Kaiser Wilhelm. He had met every living American president from Ulysses Grant forward. He had performed for crowds of 20,000 people in American cities, and he had sold tickets by the million in European capitals. The boy who had buried his father in Kansas at the age of 11 had, by his 40s, stood at the very summit of the new international celebrity culture that the late 19th century was inventing. He had made himself into a figure bigger than any single country could contain. He had done it in the space of about 15 years, and he had done it, improbably, by doing almost exactly what he had been doing since he was a boy: riding a horse, shooting a rifle, telling a story, taking care of the people who worked for him, writing letters home to Louisa. The second half of his life, the part that would see the town founded and the ranch built and the dam dreamed of and the fortune lost and the marriage broken and rebuilt, was about to begin. Between 1895 and the early years of the new century, Cody poured most of his money into a project that had nothing to do with the arena. He had first passed through the Big Horn Basin of northwestern Wyoming in the 1870s. He had been impressed by the country. In 1895, he began the work of founding a town there. He named it after himself. Cody, Wyoming, was incorporated in 1901. It had streets named after Cody's business partners, Nate Salisbury and others. In 1899, Cody helped found the local newspaper, the Cody Enterprise, which is still publishing today. In 1902, he opened the Irma Hotel, named after his daughter, which still stands. In 1905, he completed construction of the Wapiti Inn and the Pahaska Tepi, a set of traveler lodges along the road that would become the main route from Cody east into Yellowstone National Park. He acquired a large ranch called the T.E. Ranch, about 35 miles south of the town, where he kept cattle, ran pack trips, and entertained European and American guests. The Dude Ranch as an American institution, the place where Easterners pay to experience a performed version of Western life, owes a fair portion of its invention to what Cody was doing at the T.E. in the first decade of the 20th century. He was also pouring money into an irrigation scheme. In 1897 and 1899, Cody and his associates acquired water rights from the state of Wyoming to divert water from the Shoshone River, which ran through the Big Horn Basin, and to use that water to irrigate roughly 169,000 acres of land. The plan was ambitious. The plan required a canal. The plan did not include a storage reservoir, which would have required a dam. Cody and his partners could not raise the capital to complete the project. In 1903, they asked the federal government to take over. The newly formed Reclamation Service, later the Bureau of Reclamation, agreed. Construction of the Shoshone Dam began in 1905. When it was completed in 1910, it was the tallest dam in the world. Decades after Cody's death, Congress renamed it the Buffalo Bill Dam. None of these ventures, however, made Cody rich. The Dude Ranch bled money. The hotel was a modest earner. The newspaper was small. The irrigation project ran out of capital. The only reliable income Cody had was the Wild West itself. And the Wild West, for all its continuing popularity, was an expensive enterprise. The company, at its peak, included as many as 1,200 performers and handlers with hundreds of horses, a dedicated railroad train that moved the whole operation from city to city, a full cowboy band, a small fleet of stagecoaches, and an armory of real and stage firearms. To keep the whole thing moving, Cody and Salisbury had to book continuously. There were no off-seasons that were truly off. The company played summer dates in the open air. It played winter dates in indoor arenas. It played, increasingly, in smaller cities that paid smaller gate receipts. Each year, the margin between revenue and expense grew thinner. Then, on October 29, 1901, a freight train collided with one of the 3 railroad units carrying the Wild West from Charlotte, North Carolina, to Danville, Virginia. The crash happened outside Lexington, North Carolina. The freight engineer had believed the entire Wild West train had already passed, when in fact he had only seen the first 2 of the 3 units. He returned to the track. He hit the 3rd unit. 110 horses, including 2 of Cody's personal mounts, Old Pap and Old Eagle, were killed in the crash or had to be destroyed afterwards. 3 young Native American performers were killed in the accident. Many others were injured. Annie Oakley, who had been a fixture of the show for 15 years at that point, suffered spinal injuries severe enough that the attending physicians told her she would never walk again. She did eventually recover enough to walk and even to perform in other productions. But she was never again the Annie Oakley she had been, and she never went back to the Wild West. The Lexington crash did not bankrupt the company, but it damaged it. The show ran at a reduced scale for the next season. Cody replaced mounts and performers. He kept booking, but the blow had been real. In 1902, Cody's theatrical partner Nate Salisbury died. Salisbury had been the financial brain of the operation for almost 2 decades. His death left Cody with new partners and with decisions he was not well equipped to make. Bad investments accumulated. Cody, who had always drunk heavily, drank more. His marriage to Louisa, which had been strained since the 1880s, came apart. In 1904, Cody filed for divorce. The case became public. It was a sensation. Divorce proceedings in the early 20th century were almost always damaging to the reputations of both parties, and Cody's was worse than most. The legal papers he filed alleged that Louisa had attempted to poison him on multiple occasions. The allegations were proven false. Louisa filed counterclaims alleging long-running infidelity on Cody's part. Witnesses testified on both sides. The housekeeper of the Cody household in North Platte testified that Louisa had been inhospitable to Cody's friends and guests. Others testified that Cody had been seen drunk and with women who were not his wife. The judge ruled against Cody. The divorce was denied. The public sided with Louisa. In February of 1905, the case was dismissed. Cody had to return to Paris, where the Wild West was touring, and continue performing. The death of the Cody's oldest daughter, Arta Louise, during the divorce proceedings in 1904, had added a layer of private grief on top of the public embarrassment. 2 of the Cody children had already died young during the years the family was living in Rochester, New York. Arta's death left only 2 surviving children, Kit and Irma. Kit would die of a childhood illness. Irma would survive her father, but not by long. In 1910, after years of separation, Cody and Louisa reconciled. They were 64 and 67 years old. They lived out their remaining years traveling together with the show. In 1908, Cody merged the Wild West with a competing operation run by a man named Gordon William Lilly, who performed under the stage name Pawnee Bill. The combined show was called The Two Bills. It was a financial necessity more than a creative decision. The Wild West could no longer sustain itself at its old scale, and a merger with Pawnee Bill's Far East, as the competitor's show was called, allowed the combined operation to tour more efficiently. The merger bought Cody about 5 more years. In 1913, while the Two Bills show was playing an engagement in Denver, Colorado, creditors seized the company's equipment. Cody had borrowed against the show to finance other failed investments, including a gold mining operation in Arizona called the Campo Bonito Mine, which had lost everything. The loans came due, the creditors foreclosed. The entire Wild West company, the tents, the horses, the costumes, the wagons, the weapons, the posters, the portable grandstands, was sold at public auction. Cody had been the owner of the most successful traveling entertainment enterprise in the world. He had played for crowned heads. He had been photographed by the finest portrait photographers in Europe. He had been a millionaire several times over. In the summer of 1913, at the age of 67, he was watching the Wild West itself being auctioned off on a dusty Denver lot. He did not retire. He could not afford to. For the next 3 years, he performed in other people's shows. He signed with the Sells Floto Circus, then with the 101 Ranch Wild West. He traveled. He performed. He was, by this point, in poor health. He had stomach problems, respiratory problems, and the lingering effects of decades of hard drinking. He continued to tour because his family needed the income. Most of the money from his prime years was gone, spent on the town of Cody, the TE Ranch, the Arizona mine, the irrigation scheme, and the endless burn rate of running the Wild West itself. In 1914, he appeared in a 3-reel silent film called The Indian Wars, in which he reenacted his killing of yellow hair. The film was made on location, partly on the actual battlefields of the Plains Wars. It included participation from Lakota veterans of some of those battles, as well as from U.S. Army veterans of the cavalry regiments that had fought them. It was an attempt, among other things, to preserve on film the memory of the conflicts before everyone who had participated in them was dead. The film was a financial disappointment. The production of it almost bankrupted Cody a second time. After filming was complete, according to several accounts, Cody asked that the actual yellow hair scalp and the war bonnet be removed from the display case where they had traveled with him for almost 40 years. They were never shown publicly again. They were placed in storage at what would eventually become the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming, where some of them still rest today, not on display. In the late fall of 1916, Cody returned to his sister's home in Denver, exhausted. He was 70 years old. He had been performing nearly without interruption since he was 11. He spent Christmas at his sister May's house. In early January of 1917, he was diagnosed with kidney failure. On January 9th, a Catholic priest, Father Christopher Walsh, of the Denver Cathedral Basilica, came to the house and baptized him into the Catholic Church at his request. The decision was unexpected. He had been initiated into Freemasonry in North Platte in 1870 and had been an active Mason for more than 40 years. He had never, in any known letter or interview, indicated a strong interest in any church. But at the end, in the house of his sister, with his wife Louisa beside him, he asked for baptism, and the next day, on January 10th, 1917, he died. The news went out immediately by wire across the country. Tributes followed from King George V of Britain, from Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and from President Woodrow Wilson. The funeral service was held at the Elks Lodge Hall in Denver. The governor of Wyoming, John B. Kendrick, an old friend of Cody's, led the procession. He was buried on June 3, 1917, on top of Lookout Mountain outside Golden, Colorado. The delay between death and burial was the result of a fierce dispute over where he should rest. His wife Louisa and his sister Mary Decker said he had always wanted to be buried on Lookout Mountain. The town of Cody, Wyoming, insisted he had wanted to be buried in the town he had founded. The family sided with Louisa. The body went to Colorado. The town of Cody never accepted it. In 1948, the Cody chapter of the American Legion offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who would steal the body from Lookout Mountain and deliver it to Wyoming. The Denver chapter of the American Legion mounted a guard over the grave. The body did not move. Rumors persisted, and still persist, that a body swap was carried out before the 1917 burial, and that Cody actually rests on top of Cedar Mountain outside the town he founded. The claim has never been verified. Congress revoked his Medal of Honor on March 3, 1917, 52 days after he died. To understand what William F. Cody left behind, you have to understand the scale of what he built. Because the Wild West was not just a touring show, it was the largest, most ambitious, most logistically complex piece of traveling entertainment the world had ever seen, and the template it established has been reverberating through American popular culture ever since. Start with the sheer size of the operation. At its peak, Buffalo Bill's Wild West employed more than 1,200 performers, handlers, stock managers, blacksmiths, cooks, drivers, musicians, and laborers. It traveled with 500 horses. It carried a portable electric generator years before most American cities had reliable electric grids. It had its own postal service. It had its own water wagons. It had a dedicated railroad train that moved the whole operation city to city with customized freight cars built to carry the stagecoaches and the buffalo and the portable grandstand seating. When the Wild West pulled into a town, it did not rent facilities. It unloaded its own arena, erected its own seating for 15 or 20,000 spectators, set up its own concession stands, and produced its own printed programs. The operational discipline required to move an enterprise of that size by rail on a nearly continuous tour schedule, 36 weeks a year, for more than 3 decades, was the discipline of a senior military logistics officer. Cody and his partner, Nate Salisbury, had, by the early 1890s, built what was in effect a private railroad regiment. No one else in the entertainment business came close. The performers Cody recruited were, by every surviving account, the genuine article. He did not hire actors to play cowboys. He hired cowboys. He sent his talent agents out to the cattle ranches of Texas and Wyoming and Montana to find riders and ropers who had done the actual work. The bronco busting was real bronco busting. The cattle roping was real cattle roping. The sharpshooting was real sharpshooting. Annie Oakley could shoot the ash off a cigarette at 20 paces. Frank Butler could shoot a coin out of his wife's fingers. Johnny Baker, Cody's adopted foster son, could shoot glass balls thrown in the air while lying flat on his back with the rifle balanced on his knees. The audience was watching people who could do the things they were watching them do. This was the hinge of Cody's whole business model. Every traveling circus in the 19th century depended to some degree on illusion. The strongman was sometimes not quite as strong as he looked. The sword swallower had tricks. The bearded lady had been assembled backstage. Cody refused that kind of staging. He insisted for 30 years that what happened in his arena was the real article, displaced from its natural setting but otherwise authentic. It was why he fought so hard to keep the word show out of the official title. Buffalo Bill's Wild West, not Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. The difference mattered to him. It mattered commercially, because the audience paid more to see the real thing, and it mattered personally, because Cody genuinely believed that what he was putting on in the arena was, at its core, a kind of honest documentary about the country he had grown up in. The finale of the show, for most of its 30-year run, was a reenactment of an attack on a settler's cabin on the frontier. Cody would ride in at the head of a mounted cavalry charge to rescue the family inside. The staging was elaborate. There were real flames, real gunfire, real horses at full gallop, real dust. The audience, whether in Omaha or London or Barcelona, would rise to its feet when Cody came galloping across the arena with his hat in his hand. For many of the spectators in American cities, the show was their only direct exposure to anything resembling the Western frontier their own country had just finished settling. For audiences in Europe, it was a glimpse into a new world that felt as exotic and as thrilling as the Roman Colosseum would have seemed to a 16th century Londoner. Cody had invented, without quite meaning to, a new genre of international entertainment. The money that flowed into the Wild West at its peak was staggering by the standards of the period. Individual performances regularly drew crowds of 20,000 paying spectators. Gate receipts during the 1887 Golden Jubilee tour in London exceeded what most Broadway productions took in over a year. Cody was personally earning, in good seasons, more than $100,000 a year, which in modern currency would be several million. He was the highest-paid performer in the world, and he spent every dollar of it. He spent on the town of Cody, Wyoming, where he was pouring money into hotels and lodges and a newspaper and a dude ranch that he genuinely believed could become the gateway to Yellowstone National Park. He spent on the Shoshone River irrigation scheme, which he believed could turn the Big Horn Basin into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the western United States. He spent on the T.E. Ranch, where he ran cattle and entertained visiting dignitaries from Europe at a scale that would have bankrupted most American millionaires. He spent on a gold mining operation in Arizona called the Campo Bonito Mine, which produced almost nothing and cost almost everything. He spent on a coal prospecting venture in Wyoming. He spent on an oil drilling venture that never produced. He bet again and again on the extractive industries of the American West that he believed were about to make the next generation of fortunes, and he bet wrong almost every time. He also gave money away, constantly, to former cowboys who had ridden with him and fallen on hard times, to old Army scouts from the campaign days, to performers who had been injured in the show and could no longer work, to widows, to orphans, to churches, to the newsboys who sold papers on the streets of the cities the Wild West toured through. Every surviving account of Cody from his last 2 decades describes him as what his generation called a soft touch. He could not or would not say no when someone asked him for help. One of his business partners wrote in a private letter late in Cody's life that keeping the old man solvent was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The money came in and went right back out. The arena he built kept running after he died. The rights to the Wild West were sold in June of 1917 for $105,000 to a man named Archer Banker of Salina, Kansas. Versions of the show continued to tour under different owners through the 1920s and into the 1930s. None of them were the original, and audiences knew it. But the template Cody had established did not die with him. It was, instead, absorbed into the bloodstream of American popular culture, where it has been running ever since. The rodeo, as we know it today, is his direct descendant. The bronco riding contests, the calf roping, the steer wrestling, the barrel racing, the grand entry with the parade of flags, the opening ceremony with the national anthem sung from horseback, every single one of those conventions was pioneered in the Wild West arena. The Old Glory blowout that Cody organized in North Platte, Nebraska on the 4th of July, 1882, is the direct ancestor of every rodeo in the United States and Canada today. The Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, the National Finals Rodeo, the Calgary Stampede, the Cheyenne Frontier Days. All of them trace their organizational DNA back to what Cody and Salisbury first staged in the open fields of central Nebraska. The Western film inherited the rest. The narrative conventions of the American Western, which would dominate Hollywood from the silent era through the 1960s, were lifted almost wholesale from the Wild West arena. The stagecoach attack, the cavalry rescue, the homesteader's cabin under siege, the nobleman in buckskin, the shootout in the dusty main street, the heroic last charge. Every one of those set pieces was staged first in Cody's arena before it ever appeared on a movie screen. The careers of John Wayne, of Gary Cooper, of Jimmy Stewart, of Alan Ladd, of every Western actor who ever rode a horse for Hollywood, were built on conventions Cody had spent 3 decades testing in front of paying audiences. The movie Western is, in a very direct and documentable sense, the Wild West after the invention of celluloid. Television inherited the template next. The Lone Ranger, Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Rawhide, The Rifleman, Maverick. Every Saturday afternoon matinee, every Sunday night Western series that ran across American television from the late 1940s through the 1970s was Cody's Wild West, adapted for a new delivery medium. The actors had changed. The costumes had changed. The technology had changed. The underlying set of set pieces was exactly what had been played, live, 6 nights a week, on an open field in North Platte or in the American Exhibition Grounds in London by a man in a red silk shirt 40 years earlier. Consider Annie Oakley alone. Cody hired her in 1885 at equal pay with his male headliners. He gave her top billing. He defended her in the press against male marksmen who resented her success. He insisted she receive the same star treatment he did. And late in his life, in a newspaper interview published in 1898, Cody said publicly that women should have the right to vote, that women should have the right to do any work they were capable of doing, and that if a woman did the same work as a man, she should receive the same pay. "Set that down in great big black type," he told the reporter. "Buffalo Bill favors woman suffrage." He said it 22 years before the 19th Amendment. Annie Oakley was not the only headliner Cody made famous. Johnny Baker, whom Cody informally adopted as a foster son and who lived with the Cody family for much of his boyhood, became one of the most accomplished trick shooters of his generation. Baker could shoot glass balls out of the air while lying flat on his back, with the rifle balanced on his knees. He could shoot a silver dollar out of an assistant's fingers at 20 paces. He stayed with the Wild West for its entire 30-year run and eventually became the show's manager in its last years. Frank Butler, Annie Oakley's husband, became her stage assistant and manager and was, by every surviving account, one of the few men of the 19th century who could recognize that his wife was better at their shared profession than he was and willingly step into a supporting role. Lillian Smith, a young Californian who joined the show in the late 1880s, was billed as the champion girl rifle shot of the world. Gabriel Dumont, the Métis military leader who had commanded Louis Riel's forces at the Battle of Batoche in the 1885 Northwest Rebellion in Canada, performed sharpshooting acts in the Wild West after the rebellion was suppressed, and he was granted safe passage out of Canada by the Canadian government. Calamity Jane, whose real name was Martha Jane Canary, and who had worked as a freight hauler and Army scout before drifting into the Wild West circuit, appeared as a storyteller beginning in 1893. The company Cody assembled was, in effect, a small traveling republic of the most distinctive frontier personalities of the late 19th century. He collected them the way other men collected horses or paintings. He was also, from his 40s on, a personal friend of every American president from Ulysses S. Grant forward. Grant had hosted Cody at the White House in the early 1870s after the Medal of Honor was awarded. Rutherford B. Hayes had invited him to state dinners. Chester A. Arthur had asked him for Western stories during formal receptions. Grover Cleveland attended Wild West performances on multiple occasions and exchanged personal correspondence with Cody afterward. Benjamin Harrison had given Cody a personal audience at the White House in 1889. William McKinley had sent an honor guard of American cavalry to meet Cody's return from his European tour in 1902. Theodore Roosevelt, as already noted, was the closest presidential friend Cody ever had, and the two men corresponded regularly through Roosevelt's presidency and afterward. William Howard Taft hosted Cody at the White House in 1910. Woodrow Wilson, the president under whom Cody would die, sent a personal telegram of condolence to Louisa on the day of his death. Cody had known and been known by every chief executive of the United States during the entire adult life of the Wild West, a span of 12 administrations and 44 years. No other American performer of his era has held that kind of continuous presidential access. The scale of what Cody and Nate Salisbury had put together is almost impossible to appreciate from a distance of more than a century. Consider the logistics of a single weekday performance in Paris in June of 1889 during the Exposition Universelle. The grounds at Neuilly had been built out for the occasion to seat 15,000 spectators. The arena floor was 120 yards long and 50 yards wide, covered in imported sand for the horsework. The performers included more than 200 riders, a full cowboy band, a company of stagecoaches, a live buffalo herd penned in holding corrals behind the arena, and a company of Russian Cossacks Cody had added to the 1889 tour as the newly titled Congress of Rough Riders of the World. The show opened with a grand entry parade, 20 minutes of thundering horsework, with riders from 6 countries circling the arena in sequence. It included a staged Pony Express relay at full gallop. It included a cattle roping exhibition by the Texas Cowboys. It included Annie Oakley's sharpshooting act. It included a staged stagecoach robbery and rescue. It closed with the attack on the settlers' cabin finale, with Cody himself riding at the head of the cavalry charge, hat in hand, the full weight of his 15,000 paying spectators on their feet and cheering. The performance ran 2.5 hours. It ran, in that same form with only minor variations, twice a day, 6 days a week, for the full summer. Rosa Bonheur came 3 afternoons in a row to sketch the horses. The French military attaché was a regular attendee. The Russian ambassador came twice. The American ambassador hosted a formal dinner for Cody afterwards, at which the guests included 3 future heads of European governments. That was 1 city in 1 summer. Multiply it by the 8 European tours Cody would make between 1887 and 1906. Multiply it by the 25 American tours between 1883 and 1913. Multiply it by the tens of millions of tickets sold. What Cody had built was, at its peak, the single most successful touring entertainment enterprise in world history up to that point, and it would not be surpassed in scale or geographic reach until the advent of international motion picture distribution in the 1930s. Consider the buffalo. Cody had spent his early 20s killing them. In his 50s and 60s, as the size of the surviving wild herds shrank to a few hundred animals, he became one of the early public voices calling for their protection. He spoke out against hide hunting. He advocated for formal hunting seasons and for federally protected preserves. He supported the efforts of the American Bison Society. He supported Theodore Roosevelt, whom he knew personally, in the creation of what would become the National Wildlife Refuge System. The bison that survive today in Yellowstone and on protected ranges across Montana and the Dakotas owe some part of their survival to the lobbying of men like Cody, who had helped drive the species to the edge of extinction and then, late in life, used his fame to try to pull it back. Consider the town of Cody, Wyoming, which he founded in the 1890s and which still stands today at the eastern gateway to Yellowstone National Park. The Irma Hotel, named after his daughter, is still open for business. The Cody Enterprise, the newspaper he founded in 1899, is still publishing. The Pahasca Teepee, the traveler's lodge he built along the road to Yellowstone, is still operating. The Buffalo Bill Dam, which he spent years advocating for and which was the tallest dam in the world when it was completed in 1910, still holds back the Shoshone River and irrigates the Bighorn Basin. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West, which his wife Louisa helped found after his death, is now one of the finest museums of Western history anywhere in the world, holding his personal papers, his stage costumes, his saddles and rifles, the Rosa Bonheur portrait painted in Paris in 1889, and the archival record of a life that touched almost every public figure of its era. Consider the global reach of his fame. The residents of the Südstadt neighborhood in Karlsruhe, Germany, are still nicknamed Indianer more than a century after Cody's Wild West played there. A statue of him stands today in the Dennistoun neighborhood of Glasgow, Scotland, where the show performed from November of 1891 through February of 1892. In the Belgian Congo in the 1950s, young men and women who called themselves Bills formed neighborhood clubs modeled on the Buffalo Bill films distributed across the European colonial empires, and some of them went on, after Congolese independence, to careers in African popular music. The National Football League's Buffalo Bills took their name from him at a distance of 30 years after his death, because the name was already part of the common American vocabulary. His character has been portrayed on screen by Joel McCrea, Charlton Heston, Paul Newman, Keith Carradine, Peter Coyote, J.K. Simmons, and John C. Reilly. Mark Twain wrote about him. E. Cummings wrote about him. Francesco de Gregori, the great Italian singer-songwriter, wrote a song about him. Eminem wrote a song about him. The Beatles, almost certainly, referenced him in the title of the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. His name has become, over the century since his death, a kind of free-floating American shorthand, available to anyone who wants to evoke the particular combination of showmanship and frontier bravado that he came to represent. That is the legacy. A town that still stands, a newspaper that still publishes, a dam that still holds back a river, a rodeo tradition that fills arenas across the continent every weekend, a Western film genre that defined American cinema for 3 generations, a sharpshooter he paid equal wages and then publicly advocated for her right to vote, a bison species he helped drive down and then helped pull back, a museum that holds his papers, a grave on Lookout Mountain above the Great Plains, and a name that every child in the English-speaking world still recognizes more than a century after the man wearing it took his last breath in his sister's house in Denver. He had been Buffalo Bill for almost 50 years. He had been William F. Cody for 70. And the country he had spent his life performing for was, in every measurable way, changed because he had lived in it. There are smaller pieces of the story worth naming before we close the book on him, because they tell us what the man himself was like when he stepped out of the arena at the end of the night. He was, by every surviving account, an excellent storyteller. Not a good writer, A good writer does not ghost three autobiographies that contradict each other on basic dates, but a storyteller at a campfire or a dinner table, a man who could hold a room of European aristocrats or a bunkhouse full of cowboys equally well, who had a working memory for names and faces so sharp that he could pick out a trooper he had served with 20 years earlier in a crowd of thousands. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was not easily impressed by anyone, wrote personal letters attesting to Cody's character and bravery during the Indian Wars years. General Philip Sheridan, who had handpicked Cody to be chief of scouts for the 5th Cavalry, considered him one of the best scouts he had ever employed. General Nelson Miles trusted him enough to send him on the 1890 mission to Standing Rock. These were three of the most powerful military officers of the post-war period, and all three of them kept Cody as a personal friend for the rest of their lives. He was a Mason. He had been initiated into Platte Valley Lodge No. 32 in North Platte, Nebraska on March 5, 1870, when he was 24 years old. He received his 2nd and 3rd degrees the following year. He became a Knight Templar in 1889. He earned his 32nd degree in the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry in 1894. He attended lodge meetings in cities across the United States and Europe when the Wild West was on tour, and he took his Masonic obligations seriously enough that his funeral in Denver in January of 1917 was conducted as a full Masonic service, one day after his deathbed Catholic baptism. The two rites were not, in his mind, a contradiction. They were both parts of a long life. He drank. He drank heavily for most of his adult life, with periodic sincere attempts to stop. Alexander Majors, the old Baptist partner in the freight firm that had first employed him, had required every employee to sign a pledge against liquor, and Cody had signed that pledge at the age of 11. He kept it, more or less, through his teens. By his 20s, serving on the plains, he was drinking regularly. By his 40s, managing the Wild West, he was drinking heavily. His wife Louisa's long-running complaints about his behavior, which became public during the 1904 divorce proceedings, centered in large part on his drinking and on the company he kept when he was drinking. He tried to stop at several points. He never quite succeeded. It was one of the private costs of the public life. He loved his horses. The names of his personal mounts were familiar to his audiences. Brigham, the first horse he owned as a professional buffalo hunter, named after Brigham Young. Old Charlie, who carried him through much of the Warbonnet Creek campaign. Old Pap and Old Eagle, the two personal mounts killed in the 1901 Lexington train crash, whose deaths Cody publicly mourned in newspaper interviews for weeks afterward. McKinley, the horse he rode in the Wild West arena during the show's peak years in the 1890s. Isham, the white horse that carried him in the Grand Entry Parade across European capitals. He buried his favorites on the T.E. Ranch. He spoke of them in letters and interviews with the kind of plain affection a man shows for companions who have carried him through things that he survived, in large part because the horse did. He was, from his 40s on, a close personal friend of Theodore Roosevelt. The two men had met on a Western hunting trip in the 1880s, had hit it off immediately, and had stayed in correspondence for the next 30 years. Roosevelt quoted Cody in letters. Cody campaigned for Roosevelt's presidency. When Roosevelt assembled the Rough Riders for the Spanish-American War in 1898, he briefly considered asking Cody to recruit a company of cowboys from the Wild West for service in Cuba, a plan that was eventually set aside when it became clear that the show could not spare the manpower. Roosevelt's later conservation campaigns, which would create the National Wildlife Refuge System and preserve the surviving American bison herds, were informed in part by what Cody told him about the state of the Western landscape. Roosevelt once wrote that Cody was one of the 2 or 3 most quintessentially American men he had ever known. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, thousands, when you count the business correspondence that his secretaries handled for him. The surviving personal letters to his wife Louisa, to his sisters, to his daughter Irma, to old army friends, show a man who was sentimental about family and who worried, throughout his later years, about the people in his life who depended on him financially. He sent money home, he sent money to his sisters, he sent money to former cowboys whose wives had written to him asking for help. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West holds the surviving correspondence, and any visitor who spends a morning with it comes away with the same impression. Cody was, at his core, a man who worried about the people he loved and who tried, within the limits of his own chaotic finances, to take care of them. He was baptized into the Catholic Church on January 9th, 1917, at the home of his sister, May Decker, in Denver, by Father Christopher Walsh of the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception. His wife Louisa was in the room, his sisters were in the room. He was lucid. He asked for the baptism himself. He died the next morning. The priest and the family agreed that he had made the decision in his own clear mind and that it had been a decision he had been moving toward for some time. Whatever he had believed through the rough years on the plains, through the arena and the European tours and the failed gold mines, what he believed at the end was that he wanted to go to the next world in the company of a church. That is the private Cody, the one the arena did not show, the one who drank and wrote letters and buried his horses and kept his old army friends close and asked for baptism at the end. He had been a public figure for almost 50 years. He had performed for millions. But the person who lay in the bed in his sister's house in Denver on the morning of January 10th, 1917, was not the public figure. He was the man that public figure had been built on top of, and he went out the way he had come in, quietly, among the people who had known him longest. What, in the end, do we do with him? It is easy, from a distance of more than a century, to flatten William F. Cody into a caricature. The buckskin showman, the shameless self-promoter, the man in the red silk shirt and the long hair who put the American frontier in an arena and sold tickets. That caricature is not wrong. It is just incomplete, because the man behind the caricature was something more interesting. He was a working-class boy from Kansas who took responsibility for his family at the age of 11 and never stopped working a day in his life until the morning he died. He was a genuinely skilled horseman, shooter, and scout, whose abilities were attested to by 3 of the most powerful generals of the post-war American military, none of whom were easy to impress. He rode 350 miles in 58 hours through hostile country as a lone Federal dispatch courier and covered the last 35 miles on foot. He earned the Medal of Honor in a cavalry engagement on the Loup Fork of the Platte River on April 26, 1872. He fought in 16 documented engagements during the Plains Wars. He was, by any fair measure, as legitimate a frontiersman as any other man of his generation. He was also, and this is the part that separates him from every other frontier figure of his era, a businessman of absolute genius. He understood, before almost anyone else alive, that the frontier was going to be remembered more than it was going to be lived, and he put himself in the position to profit from the remembering. He built a traveling enterprise that was larger and more logistically sophisticated than most regiments of the United States Army. He took that enterprise to every major city in the United States and to most of the major cities of Europe. He played for 21 presidents, 5 reigning European monarchs, and 1 sitting pope. He earned and spent what would be tens of millions of dollars in modern currency. He died broke. He gave most of the money away while he was alive to people who had asked him for help and to projects he believed in, like the town of Cody and the Shoshone Dam and the Bighorn Basin irrigation scheme. He loved his wife imperfectly and sometimes terribly for 51 years. He lost 3 of his 4 children. He outlived most of his old Army friends. He kept his personal Masonic Lodge membership active for nearly half a century. He was baptized into the Catholic Church the day before he died. He was given a Masonic funeral. He was buried on Lookout Mountain outside Golden, Colorado, on a bluff where on a clear morning you can see 50 miles out over the Great Plains he had ridden across as a boy. He supported women's suffrage in print in the largest newspapers of his day, 22 years before the 19th Amendment became law. He paid Annie Oakley equal wages with his male headliners and defended her in the press. He advocated in the last 2 decades of his life for the protection of the bison herds he had helped to drive toward extinction in his 20s. He supported Theodore Roosevelt's conservation work. He campaigned for the creation of what would become the National Wildlife Refuge System. He was, to use a word that had not yet been invented in his lifetime, an early conservationist in the modern American sense. He invented, in an open field in North Platte, Nebraska, on the 4th of July, 1882, the template that every rodeo in North America still follows today. He invented, in the Wild West arena, the narrative conventions that every Western film Hollywood has ever produced has inherited. He was, for 30 years, the bridge between the real American frontier and the remembered American frontier. He was the last man alive who had lived the first, and the first man alive who successfully sold the second. He was not a simple man. His legacy is not a simple legacy. Every attempt to reduce him to a single verdict, hero or villain, authentic or fraudulent, pioneer or profiteer, misses the point. He was all of those things at different moments of the same long life, and sometimes all of them at once. What we can say, with confidence, is that he was the most famous American alive at the turn of the 20th century. What we can say is that the particular way the world has remembered the American West, for the 150 years since, is in large part the way Cody taught it to. What we can say is that when he rode into an arena at full gallop, at the head of a column of cowboys, with his hat in his hand and the audience on its feet, he was doing the thing that he had been put on this earth to do, and he knew it, and he did it better than anyone else ever has. If you stand today on Lookout Mountain, above the grave, you can see the country he came out of. The plains stretch away to the eastern horizon, pale grass and wind, and the shadows of clouds moving across the open ground, the same ground he had first ridden as a boy, carrying messages for a freight company at 11 years old. To the west rise the Rocky Mountains, the same mountains he had crossed for the Pony Express, and for the Army, and for the Grand Duke of Russia, and for his own reasons so many times in so many seasons that he had eventually stopped counting. Somewhere south, beyond the horizon, is the town that still carries his name. Somewhere north is the Bighorn Basin and the dam that still holds back the Shoshone River, exactly as he had originally dreamed it would. Somewhere east is the grave of his wife Louisa, at his side on Lookout Mountain, which is where she wanted him to rest, and where he wanted her to rest, and where they have lain together now for more than a century. He had come a long way from the 11-year-old boy in the borrowed coat at his father's graveside in the Kansas wind. A long, strange, spectacular way. He had carried his mother and his sisters out of poverty. He had put his own name on a town, a hotel, a newspaper, a dam, a ranch, a highway, a museum, a mountain. He had become, for a handful of years around the turn of the 20th century, the single most recognizable human being on the face of the earth. And when the money was gone, and the Wild West had been auctioned off in Denver, and the partners were dead, and the old friends were buried, and the health had failed, he had gone home to his sister's house to die among the people who had known him since he was a boy. He had asked for a priest. He had asked for his wife. He had not asked for a crowd. At the end, the showman had put down the show. The crowd came anyway. King George V of Britain sent a tribute. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent a tribute. President Woodrow Wilson sent a tribute. The governor of Wyoming led the funeral procession in Denver. The tributes ran in newspapers on 4 continents, in every language the Wild West had ever toured in. A boy who had buried his father in Kansas at 11, with no money and no prospects, and nothing but the use of a good horse, had gone out, at 70, as the American. He had done everything. He had been everywhere. He had been seen by more people across more countries than any American before him. And he had done every one of those things, every mile and every ride and every show and every city and every continent and every crowd, in a red silk shirt with silver buttons, at full gallop, with his hat in his hand and the audience behind him on its feet and cheering. That is William F. Cody. That is Buffalo Bill. That is the man. If this story moved you, leave a like so others can find it. Subscribe for more true histories of the people who shaped the American frontier. Thanks for spending time with Western Pioneer Archives.